Greetings, traveler. Often, when we're doing our game design, we have to create a boss monster for the player to fight. This is not only challenging because it's a big encounter and it's an important point in the game, but it's also difficult because bosses can easily become overpowering for the player. And if the player cannot beat a boss, there's a high chance of them leaving the game altogether. So today, I want to talk about some practical steps on how to approach this very common game design situation and give a way for making boss encounters rewarding to play rather than making them feel punishing and strict. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 14 years now, and making boss monsters was something that always scared me. Making a single enemy was okay because a single enemy is meant to be defeated easily, but a boss monster is supposed to be challenging. Yeah, that is its definition. It's supposed to challenge the player and make the player feel this feeling of achievement once the boss is defeated. So, how can we balance these two aspects? How can we make a boss feel difficult and challenging and make it earn its title as a boss of the level, while at the same time making the experience fun and approachable, specifically to first time players of this boss, and make sure that the player understands the mechanics of the encounter and understands what needs to be done. And if the player succeeds, they know what they did well. And if the player fails, they have a very, very clear idea of how it went wrong and what to do next time. So let's jump in. First, let's do some housekeeping to know exactly what situation we're talking about. So bosses in monsters bosses in games for this kind of case are usually acting as gatekeepers of content. So either they hold some great treasure, some great reward that the player wants, some new weapon, some new ability or something that the player really, really wants. And to get that ability, they have to defeat this boss. Or they're literally gatekeepers in the sense that to progress from one level to the next, you must defeat this boss. So that's typically the role. If they're not acting in that role, then this is not really the situation we're talking about. And of course, different roles apply in that case. But if the player wants to defeat the monster for this particularly good reward it has, or it's uh, simply in the way, or it's guarding a level, or it's stopping the progression of the player, then this is the case we're going to talk about. So here I have a very silly example that will have enough detail, hopefully, to illustrate this case. But basically, we're talking about a monster that is much stronger than the player. And the way we display this is very important here. So even in this silly drawing, you can see that the player here is much smaller and looks much weaker than the bigger, scarier monster. That immediately tells the player that this is a difficult opponent to beat. We additionally display that by their hit points and maybe even attack values, if you can show the attack values. So this monster has 1,000 hit points, the player only has 100. The monster has 500 attack, which means for every single attack that the monster makes, it deals 500 hit points of damage, while the player only has 100 attack. So that means that for the player to kill the monster, he needs to land 10 successful attacks, and for the monster to kill the player, just one is enough. But wait a minute, we just said that we want to make boss encounters fun and rewarding and easy to approach and so on, and we want to move away from this very punishing, very strict encounter. So how can we do it in this situation? Very good question. Let's jump in. When we're starting to design this encounter, we want to think about what we want the player to do, what we want to teach the player in this encounter, and what we don't want the player to do. So whether the boss is holding a treasure for the player or it's stopping the player from progressing, what is the meaning of that? Why did we put the boss there in the first place, right? So in the case of the gatekeeper, as in moving through the levels, then the idea is that as the player continues their journey through the game, then the game becomes harder and harder, which means that the player is expected to pick up most of the power ups and experience and new weapons and so on through the game, because the player is going to need that later on in the game. If the player cannot pass this boss that we have set there for him, then there's a very high chance that in the following levels he's going to have an even harder time, and he's probably not going to enjoy the game because it's too hard, and then probably he's going to quit. So that's not the desirable outcome here. But at the same time, we don't want to make the game too easy. So make the player give up because there's just no challenge in the game. So we need to strike this balance. So we have to design how we want the player to beat this monster and how we don't want him to beat it. What does that mean exactly? So in this case, we have already a situation set up for us. We want the player to, for example, avoid all the attacks of the boss while quickly making short attacks and taking advantage of the openings the monster gives in the meantime. The reason why we have such a big discrepancy in the attack values is because we want to show that, look, unlike other enemies where they can hit you several times, this boss is so strong that basically you cannot get hit at all. So what we want the player to do is avoid the big attacks from the boss and take advantage of the downtime to do his own attacks. But what we don't want the player to do is to simply attack the monster blindly and basically uh, not spend any time learning how to avoid, how to move around the monster, how to flank it, and all these great tactical things. Now, this is a very simple setup, and most games have more depth to the combat than this. But depth is something that is easy to add once we get these basics right. Without these basics there in place, no matter how many features, side attacks, special powers, environmental dangers, and so on, no matter how many of those elements we add, they will not feel that they're adding to the experience because the core of their experience is unbalanced. So when we guarantee that and we know that um, a boss monster feels challenging but approachable at the same time, then we can go on and either make combat easier by tuning the stats, making the player do more damage, for example, or we can make the battle harder by adding more tricks on the side of the boss or increasing its hit points or introducing other environmental aspects like little monsters attacking the player or um, environmental hazards like falling rocks, lava going through the level, and so on. So now that we know that we want the player to behave in this way and we don't want the player to just attack blindly, um, now we can start thinking about how to create that space for the player to, after feeling the pressure from from seeing this very big boss, how to essentially make it look approachable at the same time. So, first of all, if we don't give any warning to the player about the huge attack value of the boss, then it's very likely that the player will just sit there and just be attacked and be killed in one hit. So we don't want that. So here we have an opportunity to show the player that rather exactly how dangerous this monster is. So perhaps before attacking the player, we can show the monster attacking something else. Maybe another soldier in the game or another similarly equipped character as the player. Maybe the monster can attack another enemy that the player has faced already and kill it in one hit. So the player can make the mental connection that since it took me several hits to defeat the enemy, and this boss defeated the same enemy in one hit, then clearly that's a very strong boss. So that already puts the player in the right mindset. Another way we're signaling this is by the sheer size of the monster and its big mouth. So you see this big mouth and you think, okay, big mouth, small legs, no other visible features. So probably this monster attacks by chomping people or maybe by rolling over them or doing body slams. This is what the pure visuals of the situation signify. So if the monster, for example, could shoot a fire beam, that's not easy to know just by looking at its shape. Or if the monster has magical powers, or the monster somehow springs 17 tentacles and starts attacking the player. Yes, all these things are very possible, but they will blindside the player. And if the player dies because of these attacks, he will feel that he somehow got cheated, and the the designers are just playing a trick on him and are not giving him an opportunity to fight the boss uh, evenly or fairly in that sense. So using this technique of basically displaying the monster's power visually and on other entities in the game before the monster attacks the player themselves is a great way of informing the player way ahead of time of how dangerous this monster is. In fact, by showing the monster attacking somebody else, we also show how the monster attacks. So if the player sees the monster and he thinks, well, maybe it's going to try to eat me, or maybe it's going to try to roll over me or slam me, and these possibilities are flying around in the player's mind, by showing that the monster indeed uses the bite attack on other monsters or other characters in the game, then the player has the confirmation of which one of his ideas was right and what to expect if the monster starts to face him next. So by now, we've done all we can to signify the challenge, the perceived challenge of the boss, but still, it's very likely that the player will still receive an attack, or will not be able to dodge in time for the incoming attack of the boss. So what can we do about this? We don't want the very first attack to kill the player because it's just a very unrewarding experience. So here we still have a few tools to give the player an extra opportunity to um, figure out a way to know what to do next while still in the fight. So we don't want the situation where the monster attacks the player and kills him, and the player is forced to refight the monster, having that as the only method of learning this fight. We want to allow the player the opportunity to um, learn the fight while it happens. This way, the player feels that he figured something out during the fight. He didn't have to like open a guide or search on the internet for the solution to this fight. He learned while on the experience, and that sort of like high adrenaline learning feels very, very rewarding to do, especially during a boss fight. So we want to keep it rewarding. We want the experience to um, allow the player to enjoy learning something new during the fight. And this is before receiving the rewards and before unlocking the way to the next level or something. So to achieve this reward, we need to allow a few more telltale signs of the monster attacking the player before the monster gets to do its big chomp attack. So the way we can achieve this is by giving the player the opportunity to do something else other than other than receive the attack. So this could be a quick time event to avoid the monster's mouth if it gets too close, or a charge up animation where the monster opens its mouth and starts running towards the player. So there's these few initial moments that clearly indicate that if you don't get out of the way, you're going to get chomped, essentially. Or we we want to still allow the player to fail but learn from the experience. So perhaps the monster tries to eat the player, and the monster would have succeeded if it wasn't for let's say a pillar in the ceiling, or another obstacle in the level that stopped the monster's mouth and it didn't let it eat the player. But in that attempt, the monster broke the pillar or broke the obstacle that was stopping it from eating the player. So the next time the monster tries to eat the player, now there's nothing to stop it. So now the player knows exactly what to expect. He has witnessed the attack. He knows how it's going to happen. He knows the timing and the feeling of the attack and so on. So really, he knows that you have to avoid this. You have to get out of the way. So this is important to show first because the monster is so strong in this case, right? So the quick time events is one option if they're available in the game. Having the monster display its full attack pattern while giving the player enough time to react, or using this one-time destructible thing to save the player from the first time attack, or perhaps um, some other character in the game can sacrifice themselves or take injury in a heroic attempt to save the monster from one attack. But after they do that, the player can no longer use that character because that character is now wounded. And having that character present from the beginning is also important to show the player that there's not an infinite supply of NPCs to come save the character every time he's about to get chomped. So maybe it's a one-time thing or a two-time thing or whatever. So by now we've done all we can to display the features of the boss in a safe way and in a way that gives the player enough opportunity to um, learn the mechanics of the boss and learn what they have to do. And this works really well whether you have advanced players or beginner players, because beginner players are going to love this. They're going to really appreciate the fact that they're learning during the fight and they have a fighting chance against this super hard boss. Advanced players don't need any of that stuff, and they don't care if another character will save them if they're about to get chomped or not, because they're not going to get chomped in the first place. They know exactly what to do. So whether they're advanced or beginner, then comes the next part of showing the player how effective their attacks are going to be against the monster. So especially for the first couple of attacks, we want them to be very, very um, brightly and clearly displayed and have the monster have a huge reaction to receiving an attack. So after the player sidesteps the monster and there is uh, a great opportunity to attack the monster from its side or from behind and so on, we want the monster to overly display this wound that it received, and we want to make a big deal out of this. Why are we stressing this so much? Because we have to. This is our precious opportunity to teach the player how to beat the monster. We have to make a big deal out of this. We have to make sure that the player understands that doing it this way, so dodging the monster and then launching an attack, for example, or if you manage to attack from behind the monster rather than the flank, then that does double damage, for example. These mechanics are so important to winning the fight that we must make sure that the player at least knows about them. So definitely the first time the monster receives a wound, it needs to do a big show of, oh my god, you hit me, or oh, it hurts so much, uh, and uh, and make the player understand that this is effective. And if we want to have the mechanic of rear attacks doing double damage, for example, then we need to make an additional new animation to show that, oh, this is so much more effective than the normal attacks. If the player can keep doing it, the monster is going to be down in half the time, for example. Now, after this initial big show of receiving a wound, the subsequent wounds don't have to be as flashy. I would still make them flashy for the first 2 or 3 hits, but then we also want to show that the monster is also getting used to the fight, so it's not as surprised anymore by receiving damage. So perhaps we can tone down the effects and the dramaticism of receiving a wound for the monster after that. But the showing it during the first times is really, really important. And of course, the last point to also to again keep in mind here is that we need to allow for some failure on the player's part. So we talked before about the quick time events or the environment or another character saving the player. Perhaps it could be that the monster also was not was not actively trying to attack the player with all its might. Perhaps it was sleeping at the time, or it just considered the player a nuisance, just thought the player is annoying, so is not 100% committed into absolutely having a fight to the death with the player. So perhaps the first attack only does, let's say, 50 damage, but it's just a small nudge or just a slam. So the player knows that just a little slam from the monster is enough to do so much damage. So the next attack with the big mouth and the teeth, it's definitely going to do more of that. And even if it didn't, another 50 is enough to kill the player. So definitely, we want to avoid that as players. So there you have it. This is a framework to think about creating a monster, not in an extremely punishing way, not in a way that says, look, this is a super hard monster, but if you beat it, then there's some good rewards. But this is a way to make the fight itself feel rewarding. So in terms of psychology, this is not just a situation where you get an extrinsic reward after you beat the monster. This is a situation where you get an intrinsic reward during the fight with the monster, because the player feels that he's learning the fight, he's getting smarter, he's learning something new about this particular kind of monster. And by the monster making such a big show, especially in the beginning of receiving wounds, the player feels that he surprised the monster, he did something the monster didn't expect. And even though this is a tale that has been told infinite times in infinite games in history up to now, this fight is personal to this player. And every player out there knows that every game acts slightly differently. And of course, all the things we talked about today are present in many, many games. There's no particular innovation here. The important part here is to be conscious of these steps, knowing why boss monsters exist and the role they play in the game, and making sure we go through this checklist to know exactly what steps we cannot skip when we're creating a monster like this. And finally, let me just say again that this is one way to design a boss monster in a generic kind of way, in a way that would serve most games. Of course, perhaps there's this particular game that you're working on where this approach doesn't work and you have other particular requirements. This is completely normal. But if you don't know where to start, if the players are giving the feedback that boss encounters are way too difficult and everybody dies in one hit, and you're just lost for a way out of this and you don't know what to do to make this boss encounter more fun, then perhaps this is a good place to start from. Anyway, that's it for today. Let me know if you have any questions about this framework. I know we talked about a lot of things, and there's a lot of math and psychology and like deeper powers at play here. So if there's something I can answer, I would be very happy to. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you so much for your time, and as always, have fun.